Hello and welcome back to EPR with your favorite environmental enthusiasts, Nic and Laura. On today's episodes, we're going to give our shout-outs. Laura and I discuss some of our early career mistakes, and somehow hers is infinitely cooler than mine. And Fred Wagner, our rock star lawyer, makes his debut to talk about the significant changes from the Biden administration. Please be sure to subscribe, rate, and review. Hit that music.
All right, our shout outs for today go to our president-elect, Ronna Spellacy, and vice president-elect, Mike Mayer, both of which we have interviewed already. So check out those episodes.
Yeah.
Our treasurer-elect, Robbie Hayes, and secretary-re-elect, Michelle Rao. She's been doing an awesome job already.
She has.
We have lots of great positions and a lot of fun stuff we do on this board. So make sure that you're paying attention and can get involved now and maybe consider joining us on the board later. There are many, many more at-large member opportunities. And also send us your shout outs so that you can get your promotion or new board promotion mentioned on here. And these installments will be happening legitimately or being announced at the conference, which is happening May 17th through 20th, virtually again this year. So you can check that out at naep.org.
This episode is sponsored by Venable. Venable LLP is one of the nation's leading law firms. Venable's management reflects a commitment to diversity and inclusion through a broad category of hiring, training, and educational activities. The firm's environmental practice group works with clients across the country on major infrastructure development, including NEPA compliance and resource agency permitting. Venable encourages volunteer activities in professional environmental associations, as reflected by Fred Wagner's membership in the NAEP Board of Directors. If you would like to sponsor a future episode, head over to environmentalprofessionalsradio.com and check us out. Check out our sponsor form and help us keep the show going.
This is EPR.
Hey, Laura, what do you have for me before we get to the interview with Fred?
I see a lot and hear a lot of questions from young professionals ready to start their careers. They're terrified of messing up or I don't know what's going to happen when I get the job. They have all these questions about what's going to be like. What's it going to be like? Of course, every job is different. So I just wanted to share some of our stories so that they might understand that it's okay. And you're going to. You are. There's no way. I don't care. Fred's going to share a story with us. It doesn't matter if you are a highfalutin attorney or if you're in the field or who you are, but there are things you just don't know when you start your career, and that's okay. No one expects you to know everything.
Right.
But if we could share some stuff, that would probably be helpful to some of our younger first-time job listeners.
It's just one story of us failing is what you're asking for.
Well, if we only have a couple minutes, I could tell lots.
I know, right? I know.
Yeah. So the podcast is going to be here for a while. So we have plenty of times to sprinkle these out. And I'm sure we might think of some ones we blocked away.
I know, right? Yeah. The real trauma is hidden in our brains.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. Yeah, I love it. I love it, Laura. You're like, hey, Nic, please tell us your worst failures, please, right now in front of everyone. So when you do the NEPA process, you have to put out public notice, right?
Yeah.
And so the public notice has to go to the newspaper. It has to go on time. And the newspaper has to give you an affidavit proving that they actually published it. So that, all this fun stuff. And so the logistics of that are really important. And you have to make sure that it goes out on this date, especially if you're on a time crunch. And if you screw up, it can cost, in some cases, it's hundreds of dollars, right? But if you're in, say, San Diego, the San Diego Times, the newspaper, it's $3,000 for an ad, like a 3x5, right? If you're, I actually jokingly looked up, we were like, how much is the New York Times? Because we had a project in New York City. $16,000 was how much it was.
Wow, really?
And that's like 8 years ago, right? So the ads are really expensive. And sometimes you have to use local papers to kind of offset some of that cost. But it's also usually where your projects are. They're not usually, the whole region. They're usually small.
Sure.
So we had a project that was in California and we had the NOAA, we had the notice of availability and we set it out. And we had a fax number, a phone number, and an email address to call or, to contact us to give us comments, right? And this is like maybe 6 years ago, right? So the very recent present. And somehow somebody in one of the smaller counties that in a neighboring county and with the project actually used a fax machine for the first time in what I assume is a decade. And some people might not even know what that is, right? Some people listening to the show right now might not even understand what that means. So he used a fax machine, but I had put the phone number as the fax number. And that doesn't work for a fax. And so it was a big enough blunder to really, I was terrified. It was a big mistake that I'd made that was very small, but had significant ramifications. It's like, well, you just cost us thousands of dollars. Our client's upset. And,
no. Blame it on the new guy.
Yeah, I was really, really upset. I couldn't believe that had happened. But I'm still alive. I survived that project. It actually still made money. we didn't, lose out our hat on that. And, we smoothed things over with the client. We apologized. We came up with a solution that I was able to be a part of, and so that was really helpful for me. So I don't know, but that's one of my stories. I don't know if you have something along those lines or.
So I have a lot of stories. We'll save some for later. But for today, I think one that I love to tell, and my coworker at the time, who's still my friend now, probably hates that I tell this story because he was there, but he didn't see what I saw. Okay. We were in Upper Tampa Bay, which is, I guess it's fairly clean now, but had been, historically the most polluted area of the bay. Yeah. And it's very high up in the estuary. And we're taking samples. And the project we were doing, we had to do samples like in a line or a grid across that section. So we're just like taking some readings, motor a little bit, anchor or weight or whatever we were doing, and then take some more readings and keep going. And it's dead silent. It was a totally calm day and super silent. And I look up and I see this hump come out of the water and go back in the water. I'm silent. And I literally just and my coworker's head is down. He doesn't see this happen. And I'm like, I'm running through my entire history of living and growing up in Florida.
Right.
What was that?
What was that? Yeah. I want to know what that was.
I'm like, that wasn't a dolphin. And then I see it come up again. And the second time it was like right in front of me. And I'm still speechless. And I'm just like, it had no fin. What was that? I'm like, and then by the third time, I'm like, hey, what is this, right? Yeah. So by the time he sees it, it's a little distance away, right? So he can't get the detail of what I saw already twice. And then he's just like, it must have been some, quote unquote, some kind of dolphin. Well, that's just, there's two.
Yeah. And they both have fins.
At that point, I think I'd been working in the job. That was after my 6 months sorting sediment samples in the lab. So that was probably my first month out in the field. So I don't even know what's there and the whole inventory of species in Florida. But now I go back and I'm Googling and I'm searching, and the internet still isn't even what it is today, as far as like images and whatever. But I can't exactly find what I'm looking for. I'm like, it kind of looks like a sperm whale. And I'm like,
so it's huge.
How? Well, it wasn't that huge, but it was bigger than a dolphin, right?
Right.
And my sister coincidentally gives me a book of mammals, and I'm flipping through, and there's the exact image of a juvenile sperm whale.
Whoa.
Because their entire body doesn't come out. It's just the hump, the little.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's what I saw. 1000%.
Okay. Wow.
And this was also pre-cell phones. I don't think I owned a cell phone at that time, because then you'd have your phone out for that second time.
Of course.
Right? And so now I'm like, well, shoot, because of my ignorance, I didn't call FWC, which I should have, who may have found a sick whale up in the north part of the estuary. So there's no record of it. And the poor thing probably died up there.
Oh.
You know what I mean? It was just like, or maybe he's found his way out. I don't know. But it was just like, wow. And nobody believes me. It's my white whale.
It's funny because I was like, Laura, your story about your failure is that you saw something really cool. Mine was way worse than that.
My inability to recognize it or do something about it. I'm like, man, I could have saved this poor thing, or maybe, maybe nothing happened to him. It's like when you see a turtle crossing the road and you're like, well, I hope he made it.
Yeah, I know.
I sort of wish, when you can't stop, of course, but but yeah, was one of my many, many stories, and probably one of the most. It literally was like, wow, I don't know enough,
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to make a note to myself. Only tell much cooler stories next time for me. That's great. All right. Let's get to the interview.
You are listening to EPR.
Hello, and welcome back to EPR. We have a very special guest today. Our rock star lawyer is joining us. Fred Wagner is a partner at Venable LLP. And Fred, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do?
Sure. I am and have been for my entire career an environmental lawyer, starting at the U.S. Department of Justice in what was then called the Lands Division back in the good old days, and been in private practice and in the public sector, also as a chief counsel of the Federal Highway Administration for Barack Obama. And in all those jobs have done environmental work from litigation to regulatory to policy and counseling.
That's awesome. That sounds like a killer first job. How did you get that? How did you make that happen?
There's a program that the Justice Department runs called the Honors Program, and it's directly for people coming right out of law school. And it's very competitive. Maybe every given year they hire 8 to 12 students out of law schools around the country.
Wow.
And so I applied for it, and there's actually a good story about that. Back in the good old days, you didn't get email confirmations of your application, nor did
Right.
you get email decline letters as well. You just didn't hear. And
Right.
so
That's so funny. People always complaining today. I don't know when there's a status.
no, there was none of that. There was none of that.
Right.
And so I applied and didn't hear. And so went to plan B or plan A1, I guess, and accepted an offer from a law firm that I had clerked with the summer before, also to do environmental work.
Right.
Literally a week after I accepted at the law firm, I got a call back from the Justice Department saying, "We'd like to interview you."
Oh, wow.
And I said, "What happened? This is long past the deadline." And they said, "Yeah, we know. We lost your application."
Oh,
wow.
my gosh.
And so not only did I have to, rethink everything, but I had to call back my law firm that I had just accepted, said, "Hey, not so fast. I got this interview." And
Oh, wow.
really, it was one of those life-changing moments, Nick, where, but for the wisdom and the counsel of one person, your life can go in, a totally different direction. This was a fellow who was my mentor at the firm. And when I told him my situation and the problem, he said, "Fred, I would never in a million years hold you back from interviewing at the Department of Justice. Never." And of course, it turns out that he too was a Justice Department alum, had a great experience, at the agency, and said, "Look, you're going to have a long career, but it's just a once in a lifetime opportunity. If you get it, you should go for it. And I'll run interference with the partners here." Don't worry about it. So really, it's one of those cases where, serendipity, they find my application, good fortune by having a good mentor, somebody who, gave me great advice and supported me. It's sort of a great lesson on starting out a career.
That's a great story. Were you already, planning on environmental? Like, what was your interest in that? How'd you get into that?
I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. And so, I see so many applications here at the firm where, people are applying to environmental law practice and say, "Well, why are you interested?" They say, "Oh, because I was, hiking and backpacking my whole life, and I'm interested." I was just the opposite. I played stickball on 85th Street in Fort Hamilton Park.
Right.
And my joke is, for me, going to the country was going to Staten Island. So I didn't have that environmental ethic. What I did was had an interest in the law part of it from the very beginning. So my senior thesis in undergrad was a review of the writing of the Superfund statute back in 1979. And for those of you who remember that, it was passed the very, very, very last minute at the very end of the Carter administration. And the law was a jumble of a whole bunch of typical legislative messiness. And when I got to DC for my research project, the people on the Hill and EPA were all the happy to explain kind of what happened in getting that statute passed. So I wrote my thesis on Superfund.
Wow.
But just purely from like a political science perspective.
Yeah.
And then when I got to law school, I had an interest in environmental law, but it was only if the right opportunity came along, and luckily it did. So that's really how I got started in it.
Wow,
That's awesome.
That's cool. So has your experience or interest in the environment and getting out and hiking changed?
A little bit. I'm Jewish. And so the old saying, what is the best idea of Jewish camping? It's staying at the Yosemite Sheraton. I think I still fall in that category. Love the outdoors in doses. But really, my philosophical and, almost kind of, personal belief about environmental issues and the importance of environment is almost, stronger than me going out and hiking in it. but
Right.
that's fine. I think people approach it in lots of different ways. You could appreciate and understand, what that means for you and for your kids, even if you're not, building a fire and, roasting marshmallows. At least I think so.
Yeah. You don't have to be a hippie. I'll just say it.
It's so fun.
You have done some site inspections in the past, and I see that you did one at a missile site for the Air Force in Hawaii, and it didn't go quite as planned.
Yeah. And like I said,
Backstory on
I've been doing a NEPA work and litigation for my entire career. When I was at Justice, the section where I worked was called the General Litigation section back then. Now it's called the Natural Resources section. And our motto was, we practice environmental law if the world stopped in 1970. And so one of the big statutes that we handled was NEPA, because that was 1969, right under the deadline.
Right.
And so I've been doing NEPA litigation since the very beginning of my career. And this one case, which is public domain, so I could talk about it, was defense of the proposal to build what was then called the Strategic Defense Initiative.
Mm-hmm.
And you guys are probably too young to remember it, but it was affectionately known as Star Wars.
Yeah.
It was the Ronald Reagan proposal to put satellites up in space, shoot lasers from the ground to these satellites, bounce the lasers off the satellites, and zap whatever you wanted to zap on the ground. It was called Star Wars. Wow. And one of the places that they were going to zap these lasers from was Kauai, the Air Force base on Kauai called Barking Sands. And so as a very young lawyer, I had the privilege of flying out to Hawaii and taking a tour of the Barking Sands Air Force Base for this NEPA litigation to kind of see where they were building the missile pads to, it wasn't, missiles like launch missiles, but for these lasers. It was challenged under NEPA by local environmentalists who didn't much like Star Wars, never mind. Never mind the Air Force Base. And so I was given a tour of the missile areas. And so we went into this one building, and sure enough, there were all these missiles, on the ground or, standing up. It was really very intimidating. And I noticed that there were wires all over the ground. And it was explained to me that these were grounding wires for the missiles. They were grounding wires. And that made sense, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm walking around with the Air Force general, and literally I trip over one of those grounding wires, and it comes off.
Oh my goodness.
It comes off where it's connected to the missile. Yeah. And the Air Force general must have been to acting school, because he puts his hands to his mouth. He mouths like, "Oh my God," his eyes bug out. And I start running around should I be running out of this building? Or did I just inadvertently start World War III by tripping over this thing?
Yeah.
And for about 10 seconds, he didn't say anything. And then finally he broke out laughing, and he said, "Mr. Wagner, you would think that we'd have more than one way to control a missile than just that wire, don't you?" And of course, I acted really cool. I said, of course, I knew that. I knew that. Meanwhile, I must have looked as, pale as a ghost at the time. But yeah, one of the great things about being a lawyer in this practice and doing the kind of work I do, partnering with folks like yourselves in the environmental practice areas, these site inspections, as a lawyer, you're only as good as what you know, and every case is different. And going out on site to understand the place where you're building, the community, the nature of the project is kind of crucial. So that was one of my more memorable ones, Laura.
That's great. That's a good story. And I think it's good for people, especially young people, to hear. Everyone's got, Nic and I have talked about this. Everyone has at least one of those early career stories that are super embarrassing because we just didn't know.
Yeah. So we've teased on the podcast that, we're going to talk about the changes in the Biden administration. And, there's really nobody better than you to kind of walk us through these changes. And, there's just been a ton of executive orders that have come out with the Biden administration. So I would love your thoughts on what the legal significance of them is in general, and how are they going to dictate our policies moving forward?
Well, it's true. I can hardly remember a period of time where an administration hit the ground running with so many executive orders, and not just in the environmental space. You name it, they've done it. I think what's significant about the EOs is that in and of themselves, they certainly have legal effect, but not in the way that will 100% reverse everything that happened in the last 4 years. What an executive order does, for the most part, is dictate agency policy, direct agency research and analysis, so that it can take future regulatory or enforcement action. So, for example, there were a whole series of executive orders that said that the agency should revisit all matters involving challenges to regulations coming out of the last administration. So where does that sit? That sits with all the agencies, but of course it also sits at the Justice Department. And so what it orders the Justice Department to do is say, okay, what's the status of all our cases? Should we be putting these cases on hold? Should we be dismissing these cases? Should we be supporting these cases? What should we do? So it's an order directing policy. So in and of itself, it didn't do anything to those cases, but it said, okay, Justice Department, I'm sure there's a roster as long as your arm dealing with all this litigation. You need to take stock of it. And in the meantime, don't do anything. Right? So you shouldn't be racing out to file motions or to settle cases. Just take it easy, go slow. Once you have a sense of where everything stands, we want you to take action to deal with those cases. The same thing is true with regulations. There was a hold, all regulations that had been proposed but not finalized by the Trump administration. In and of itself, that doesn't make those proposals go away.
Right.
The agency, whatever it is, whether it's Environmental Protection Agency or whether it's the Securities Exchange Commission, they have to then evaluate, what are we going to do? What steps are we going to be taking administratively to address all this? So absolutely, I think the whole swath of executive orders sends a strong message about what policies are going to be pursued, what direction things are going to go. But from a legal matter, you need to understand that there's so much else going on. If you have the image in your head of the duck swimming around the pond, the duck may be the executive orders, but underneath the water, the duck is paddling like mad because there's a million and one things that have to happen.
It's good. It's really good to see. I imagine they're trying to work fast, knowing that, things could swing the other way at the end of this. What happens to all of the cases that have been filed against the Trump administration's past decisions?
Right. And this is happening literally day by day. Orders are coming out almost daily, either dismissing cases or telling the courts that they're not going to be defended. I think literally just yesterday, I saw the article on the pending NEPA litigation challenging the CEQ final regulations in the Western District of Virginia. The Justice Department told the court that, it wants to put all litigation on hold as the CEQ and the administration figures out what position it's going to take with the CEQ regulations. And if they withdraw them or indicate that they're going to renotice them in the Federal Register to start all over again, then that litigation is moot. So literally just yesterday, they filed a pleading with the court just saying, please, I'm sorry in terms of the timing yesterday, but just recently,
no worries.
they filed this notice saying, please don't do anything with this case. And that's happening all across the board, Laura, all across the board. For the most part, the easy stuff has been done. And the easy stuff is asking for what's called stays or holds on the litigation. That's easy. You just go to the court and say, hey, we just got to town. We're trying to figure out where the bathroom is. We don't know how to log on to computers yet. So just let us, give us some time, and we'd like a stay on all these cases. The hard part is the next part, which is, okay, now that you have figured all that out, if it's a challenge to the regulation by an environmental group, are you going to support that challenge? Or by support that challenge, are you going to announce that regulation they're challenging is going to be withdrawn or revisited? If it's the other way around, if it was an industry challenge to a regulation, are you going to oppose that? Because it's something that you support. So the hard part is now. The stays were easy, but now it's literally the evaluation of each and every case to determine, is this something that we want to move forward with? Is this something that's going to be reversed because we're going to do something new on the regulatory front, in which case then we withdraw the case, permanently. That's what's going on right now, and it's happening literally daily.
Wow. Yeah, and you're talking about rescinding, rules. One of the more fascinating things that I'm really curious about is the Congressional Review Act. The Trump administration, in Congress used that authority, was it 40 times to rescind Obama-era rules? And there wasn't a precedent for that before that. So is that going to happen again? Is that the new norm?
Yeah, it is the most fascinating thing. You're right. I mean, remember that the CRA, before the Trump administration took advantage of it, had been in place for like 20 or 30 years.
Yeah.
And it had never been used that way, even though it was on the books.
Right.
Several things, happened, I think. First is the part of the law that people forget is that if a rule is rescinded, the agency is prohibited from implementing and proposing a similar rule. So if it's a rule on certain chemicals, for example, and it's rescinded, under the terms of the rule, it's not just to prevent midnight regulation, but it's to prevent this switch, this continual flip-flop back and forth and back and forth, saying, now we're going to propose the opposite regulation.
Yeah.
So you have to deal with the CRA very, very carefully, because if it is an area where you think you may want to be regulating, and it's something that you may want to do as an agency, then you do not want the CRA to be implemented in that regard, because it prevents you from taking the opposite action. So that's the first thing that people forget. The second thing is just the closeness of the Senate. Just because you have a majority rule doesn't mean that you exercise it each and every time.
Right.
And, it's 50-50. You have a tie-breaking vote. I think part of the calculus is a sheer political one, which is, of all the things that we, meaning the Democratic majority, let's say, want to get done, and all the things that we may have to get done just with a 50 vote, or the things that we won't be able to get done because of the filibuster, do we want to waste our political capital on rescission of an otherwise kind of arcane regulation by using the Congressional Review Act? It doesn't mean that they won't at all, but the sense I'm getting from the early vibes from Congress and from the administration is that to the extent they do that, it's going to be much more refined and much more narrowly focused or narrowly tailored to a certain type of regulations, or regulations that even Republicans think are a little bit squirrely. And so I don't think you're going to see 40 examples this time around, but you may see several of them, but they'll be very directed.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm looking forward to seeing how that plays out. You mentioned CEQ regulations, and our listeners are really focused on that. There's a lot of people listening who are really interested in that final rule that came out in September. So, what do you see as the most likely path forward?
A couple of things already. I think the administration's already taken action to rescind some Trump-era guidance documents. So the Trump-era GHG guidance document is no longer. Federal Register notice was published already saying, hey, we encourage you to do a GHG analysis. And by the way, you're free to use the guidance from 2016 from the Obama administration.
Yeah.
So that's already out there, and that's already done. And that's well within the agency's authority, since it was just a guidance document to begin with. It wasn't, official, regulation. My sense is that the likely scenario is a renoticing in the Federal Register for the CEQ regulations writ large. I don't think there's going to be an appetite just for, nibbling around the edges of the regulations. I do think this team is going to want to start from scratch. Yeah. I think there's a recognition that some elements of reform are actually kind of welcome. One of the lesser reported stories of the Trump era regulation, for example, is the inclusion throughout the revised regulations of tribal governments and emphasizing the role of tribal governments. Yeah. Well, this administration is not going to, turn back on that. Right. They're certainly going to reinforce that. So they're going to go literally issue by issue. And my prediction is publish a new notice of rulemaking in the Federal Register, pointing out the areas where they want the public to pay particular attention to in their comments, and they're going to go back and try again. And we know that the areas they're going to be most focused on involve justice and equity, and public participation. And since those are the heart of the NEPA process, getting the public involved and giving the public a sense of federal agency actions, that's going to be a really key area of focus for the regulation. So anything that has in the old rules, the old final rules that had the impact of the perception, at least, of reducing public input, or making it harder for the public to comment, or making it harder for the public to challenge an agency action, those are clearly going to be on the cutting room floor for this new administration. On the other hand, this is the Build Back Better administration. Yeah. And they're also going to want to see reforms that allow NEPA analyses to be done efficiently, fairly, but efficiently. So while they may not support, a page limit, they very well may support policies that promote concise documents. I don't think anybody wants to go back to the bad old days of, encyclopedic length environmental impact statements. That's an impediment to good public participation, just the opposite. So the only way I think this administration can carefully go through the rules in a way that, hits the areas that they support, or at least somewhat support, hit the areas that they oppose, is to put it all out for, notice and comment again through the Federal Register. So that'll beg the question, that takes time.
Yeah.
At least 18 months to 2 years, at least. So then what do you do with all the documents that are in process? What do you do with all the notices of intent that'll come out between then and now? What guidance is the administration give to all those agencies and all those project proponents? Like, what rules should apply? I take it they'll say, for purposes of safety, you should apply the older rules, but who knows for sure how they're going to direct that. But as you guys know full well, the final rule proposal got over 1 million comments from the public.
Yeah.
Incredible. Now, again,
incredible.
Now take it that 950,000 of them were postcards or very short statements that said pretty much the same thing. Okay, let's take that as a given. But even so, 15, 20, 30,000 substantive comments from organizations like our own, like NEAP submitted comments. That's a lot to go through. And they finalized the rule from draft to final in less than 90 days. That's just unheard of.
Yes.
For, a rule with that many comments that has that much importance. It's the government-wide rules on how to conduct NEPA. So it's going to take more time. It's going to be renoticed. And I think the real trick for practitioners is going to be, what guidance the CEQ and each individual agency give to you about how to deal with the documents that are going to be in this purgatory between the old final rule and whatever new final rule is going to come out in a couple of years. And it's not going to be one size fit all. If you didn't plan on doing a GHG analysis for these pending documents, forget all about that. Plan to, plan to do it. If you didn't feel that you had a robust environmental justice analysis, forget about it. Go back, rethink it, do it again, because it's going to get a lot of attention from EPA and from the Justice Department, as well as from NGO stakeholders. So there is some hints, at least, about how to conduct these analyses until the rules get finalized again.
But, you touched on something. I think it's just in the back of my mind. We have all these changes coming because we have a new party in power here. We have a new administration with a completely different set of priorities. And I think that's fair to say no matter what, right? But it's really hard for me not to feel like we were going back and forth, and there's almost this yo-yo effect when we have changes of parties in the White House. So is there a hope for balance? I mean, you say this stuff, it takes time, and that makes me a little nervous, honestly. Are we going to see this all change again in 2025?
Well, I think the hope for balance will be dictated by how these new policies get implemented. In other words, is there going to be attention to the things that people really didn't like about NEPA? Are the agencies still going to be encouraged to focus just on the things that truly matter and be able to dispose more quickly on the things that don't? Will scoping be used effectively to do that? Will GHG analyses be encouraged, but not be, these kind of significance threshold determinations that people fear that would be used for these? Because we know that, except in very rare instances, a specific project would never meet the individual threshold. Is that going to be used? Will the social cost of carbon be implemented as part of that analysis? And if so, what will the burden be for that? If the sort of procedural elements become onerous again, if they become burdensome again, if we see documents taking 3-4 years again, delays because of agency review, then I fear there will be a pushback. There will be blowback on that. And that's what happened this time around. I've been engaged in NEPA reform efforts for over 20 years. And I remember going to a conference at Copper Mountain in Colorado, run by the Clinton administration, about NEPA reform. And, there were the people that stood up and said, leave it alone. It is too important. It's the grandfather of all environmental statutes. It really is the sort of linchpin of public participation. There's nothing wrong with it. Leave it alone. And I was the naysayer in the room at that time.
Wow.
And I said to them, look, no one is denying the benefits of the statute. No one is denying that, good things can come out of disclosure of impacts. Projects get changed in real ways. Mitigation truly can help. And that's really how the statute works. I said, on the other hand, though, if the position from the environmental community is that nothing needs changing, it's perfect just the way it is, everything is swell, then we become susceptible in the environmental movement, we become susceptible to political arguments from the other end of the spectrum, simply blaming NEPA. And we all know that there are more than enough examples of NEPA nightmares for both, like Cape Wind, a renewable energy project,
right.
For the Purple Line here in Maryland, a transit project. I mean, it isn't just, oil and gas projects. And there are enough examples where the process has gone haywire and it's taken too long that from a political perspective, it invites the strong pushback that we saw in the last administration against NEPA and how NEPA is implemented. And so unless we invite common sense reform, unless we truly take a hard look in the mirror about how we do these analyses, how the public interacts with NEPA, and what it truly means for better decision making that promotes better environmental outcomes. Unless we do that, we get everything we deserve, from proposals to repeal NEPA completely, to page limitations, to time limitations. We'll get all that. And I think, I don't want feel like I told you so, but I told you so. That's exactly what happened. And in large part, it was because there was a resistance to what I think is like common sense review and reform of the program. And so, Nic, I'm sorry to say that if we see that kind of pushback again, if the pendulum switch turns back, and it doesn't have to be an ultra conservative, just a standard old run of the mill Jeff Flake type of conservative would be for curtailing NEPA. And so there needs to be some recognition of how to do it in a way that avoids that scenario, that avoids the yo-yo scenario, which really makes everybody's lives so difficult in this area.
Yeah, very well said.
Thanks. I think that for me, as being sort of an outsider, I have, some experience with permitting and not necessarily any with NEPA, but I've learned a lot being on the NAEP board and appreciate you bringing all this information here. But just being an outsider watching these things happen is like, it feels like, one team comes in and says, just because you said it, I'm erasing it, whether it's good or bad. And, and it, like you said, it doesn't tie back to common sense. It goes back to like, you put your name on it, so now I want it gone,
Yeah. I mean, I'm not objective. Obviously, I was a member of the Obama administration. And so, I'll admit my bias up front, but I do think that was a telltale sign of the Trump administration. Obama did it, so, we can't do it.
Right.
And I don't think that's as much as what, the Biden folks are saying. So for example, for the Clean Power Plan, fairly recently, there was litigation that the DC Circuit overturned the Trump rule. And so some of the speculation was, well, this is great. EPA is going to have the authority to just re-implement what Obama put in place. The Clean Power Plan is back. Let's go. But that's not what they did.
Yeah.
That's not what they did. They said, we're starting again. We're going to look at this program fresh with a new set of eyes. And some of it may look like what was in the Clean Power Plan, but we're going to do this again. That, to me, indicates that the reaction, Laura, is not, well, Trump did it, so we're doing the opposite. I think the reaction is, what's the best way to go about this? And in a lot of instances, the Trump record on rescinding its rules was lousy.
Yeah.
They did not follow the process well. They lost a huge number of cases. Very surprising, because you have to really work hard if you're the government to lose an APA case. And they did. They lost, a tremendous percentage of these cases. Why? Because it just felt like a lot of the cases they were reversing just cause.
Yeah.
Instead of having a rational basis tied to this new policy. The Biden administration isn't going to make that mistake. They're going to have rational policies tied to these revised or new regulations. But if they had the chutzpah to say, we're not even doing the Clean Power Plan, we're doing our own plan, to me, that indicates, Laura, that they're going to take a hard look at all these regulations, whether it's in the environmental space or just the commercial business regulations, to try to do what they think is best and, where the science, points. Certain things, they're absolutely going to reverse. There's no question that they're going to reverse it because they disagree so wholeheartedly with the regulatory initiative from the Trump administration. But in other instances, I think enough time has passed, between some of these initial regulations to say, hey, look, where do we stand now? What's the best way to go about whatever the initiative is. So it isn't necessarily just because they did it, we're not. I think it is, they did it. What did it mean? They did it. Was it the best thing to do? If we want to move in another direction, what's the best way of going about it that we can get to where we want to go most expeditiously? Because I think, Nic, you said it earlier, 4 years blows by in a heartbeat.
Yeah.
And, there's no guarantee that it's going to be a Democratic administration starting in 2025. No guarantee at all. So people are very, very cognizant of the import of time.
It does. But I feel like the last 4 years was much longer than 4 years.
Yeah.
That was a long 4 years.
Yeah. I took a picture of, I'm fostering dogs during the pandemic. That's kind of my
that's awesome. What kind of dogs?
Activity, all kind of dogs, mostly smaller ones. But I had a picture of one dog. I took a picture on inauguration day, and it was the foster dog. Me and my wife watching the inauguration. Mm-hmm. And I took a picture, and the caption of the picture was the dog saying, "Hey, you think that was bad for you? That was 28 years in my time."
Oh, that's great. Oh, I love it.
Oh, well, Fred, it's been awesome having you on here. Yeah. And it's really good to have someone who can come and give us the lowdown on this stuff. We will be having you back, and, we can continue to talk about what's going on and what your thoughts are.
And more on foster dogs as well. We got to make sure we cover it. Yeah.
I'm sure there's some fun stories there. Yeah. Is there anything else you want to share?
Yeah, no, just this. I think the very first thing you said, Nic, is what's going to be true throughout this entire year. This stuff is going to happen fast.
Yeah.
Now, while rulemaking takes a long time, the quantity of rulemaking, the quantity of guidance documents, the quantity of new enforcement initiatives, the quantity of new cases, it's going to be mind-blowing. So I think it's really imperative to keep track of all this stuff as an environmental professional, because your life, Laura, from your perspective as a permitting expert, from some of the other members as kind of NEPA specialists, your lives are going to be changing from month to month.
Yeah.
And so keeping track of these directions, these statements from the agencies, the Federal Register notices is probably more important than ever. And I'm really glad that Venable LLP is, sponsoring the podcast with you guys. And I'll be able to, get back in touch with you about some of these developments. Some will be very narrow and very specific. Some may be general. But the last thing I'd say is that I think more than ever, and I'm so proud to be on the NAEP board, the relationship between the legal side and the environmental professional side, I think is more important than ever.
Yeah.
It's just more important than ever, to ensure that what you're doing for your clients is defensible, supportable, the strategies that you guys propose to your clients, to how to get to, the end game for permits, to be aware of these legal standards and how they're shifting, how they're being enforced in court. It's more important than ever. And so I'm really, really pleased to have this partnership.
Yeah, that's a great point. Well, thank you so much for being here. If people want to reach out and connect with you, do you have a suggestion for how they do that?
Well, sure. The NAEP website, I think, lists me as an at-large board member. I think I could be contacted through that. Or, of course, through my Venable web address, frwagner@venable.com, frwagner@venable.com, and happy to answer any questions from the audience.
Awesome. Thanks. Nic, anything left from you?
No. Fred, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciated having you on.
All right. Have a great weekend, guys.
Yeah, you too.
Thanks, Fred. That's our show. Thank you so much to Fred Wagner for joining us today. This was really awesome information. And please be sure to check us out next Friday when we interview Stacey Gold on diversity, equity, and inclusion and all of the amazing work that she's doing. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review us. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening, everybody.